The Senate chamber was unusually tense that evening, its marble pillars casting long shadows under the dimmed lights. Cameras rolled silently from the press gallery, capturing every flicker of movement on the floor. John Thune, the tall, seasoned senator from South Dakota, adjusted his tie and leaned toward the microphone. His voice carried with the confidence of a man who had spent decades inside Washington's inner circle. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thune began, "we must be careful not to let populist soundbites replace serious policy. This chamber demands responsibility, not reckless slogans." Everyone in the room knew who the target was. JD Vance, the freshman senator from Ohio, sat firmly in his seat, his jaw clenched. Thune's remarks weren't just political, they were personal. The establishment figure was casting Vance as an amateur, unfit for the weight of national leadership. Vance didn't flinch. His calm gaze met Thune's, as though he had been waiting for this very moment. For weeks, whispers in Washington had suggested that Thune and his allies were quietly undermining Vance's credibility, branding him as a populist firebrand with no real plan. Tonight, Thune decided to make the attack public. The chamber shifted uncomfortably. Some senators nodded subtly in agreement with Thune's rebuke, while others leaned forward, eager to see how the young firebrand would respond. The air felt electric, like the seconds before a storm breaks. Vance slowly rose to his feet. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in his tone silenced the room instantly. "Senator Thune," he said evenly, "if telling the truth about what American families face is a slogan, then maybe Washington could use a few more slogans and a lot less empty speeches." Murmurs rippled across the floor. Reporters scrambled to jot down every word. Thune had fired the opening shot, but Vance had answered with a blow that cut deeper than expected. The battle lines were drawn. Thune narrowed his eyes, clearly irritated that Vance had deflected his jab with such poise. He leaned back toward the microphone, his voice rising. "Senator Vance, Ohioans deserve more than anecdotes. They deserve policies grounded in reality, not campaign trail theatrics. This chamber cannot operate on the fuel of outrage." It was a classic establishment move: discredit the messenger by painting him as emotional, unserious, or unfit for serious governance. For decades, this tactic had worked. Washington was a place where the polished often silenced the passionate. But JD Vance was cut from different cloth. He stepped forward, his expression calm, almost surgical in precision. "Reality?" Vance asked, his voice measured but firm. "Reality is a mother in my state who works 2 jobs and still can't afford childcare. Reality is a father who fought in Afghanistan and came home to a town gutted by fentanyl, while Washington argues about abstract policy points. If that's not reality, then I'd like to know what you call it." The silence in the chamber was deafening. Even those who had nodded along with Thune minutes earlier avoided his gaze now. Reporters' pens moved furiously, and a few cameras zoomed closer to Vance's face. He wasn't just defending himself, he was indicting the entire system. Thune, visibly unsettled, forced a thin smile. "Senator Vance, emotional appeals may win applause on cable news, but here, facts matter." Vance didn't hesitate. "Facts? Let's talk facts, Senator." "Fact: wages for working Americans have stagnated while corporate profits have soared. Fact: our border communities are collapsing under the weight of a crisis this body refuses to address. Fact: every time we propose real solutions, the establishment dismisses them as too extreme. That's not governing, that's avoidance dressed up as leadership." Gasps and murmurs broke out across the chamber. Thune had expected a rookie to stumble under pressure, but instead, Vance had flipped the script. What was supposed to be a public shaming had turned into a masterclass in striking back. For the first time, Thune's polished veneer showed cracks. Thune gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles widening as the chamber buzzed with JD Vance's words. He had intended to expose Vance as inexperienced, but instead, the Ohio senator had shifted the ground beneath his feet. The veteran lawmaker cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Senator Vance, Thune said, governing isn't about fiery rhetoric or pointing fingers. It's about building consensus. You cannot lead this nation by sowing division. A few senators nodded in cautious agreement, but the energy in the room had already shifted. Vance stepped forward, his tone calm but edged with steel. With all due respect, Senator Thune, Washington has been obsessed with consensus for decades. And what has it produced? Endless debt, broken borders, and communities drowning in despair. If consensus means doing nothing while the American people suffer, then I refuse to be part of that charade. The chamber erupted in hushed whispers. Reporters looked at one another wide-eyed, as if they had just witnessed the spark of something seismic. Thune attempted to interject, but Vance pressed on, his voice ringing with conviction. You call my words fiery. I call them honest. You call me divisive. I call myself accountable to the people who sent me here. And the truth, Senator, is that Americans don't care about consensus in this room. They care about whether they can afford groceries, whether their kids are safe, whether their country still belongs to them. The rawness of Vance's words cut through the chamber like a blade. Some senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others leaned forward, compelled despite themselves. Thune's decades of polished politics suddenly looked stale next to the unfiltered urgency of Vance's message. Thune, flustered, raised his hand. And what do you propose then, Senator? Chaos? Populist slogans don't pay bills, and they certainly don't secure borders. Vance met his gaze without blinking. No, Senator. What I propose is courage. The courage to act when the facts are staring us in the face. The courage to put the people above the lobbyists. The courage to stop pretending that endless talk will fix a country that's bleeding. The chamber went silent once again. And in that silence, it was clear, the young senator had just outmaneuvered a Washington veteran. The tension in the chamber was now thick enough to cut with a knife. Thune straightened his papers, trying to mask the growing frustration on his face. He was a veteran of countless political battles, but this exchange felt different. JD Vance wasn't playing by Washington's old rules, and that made him unpredictable, even dangerous to the establishment. Senator Vance, Thune said slowly, you speak of courage, but true courage is compromise. True courage is knowing when to bend so that the institution survives. Without it, this republic collapses into gridlock and chaos. The words carried the weight of tradition, but they lacked the fire to ignite the room. Vance, on the other hand, wasted no time striking back. He took a deliberate step forward, locking eyes with Thune. No, Senator. That's not courage, that's surrender. And the American people are tired of leaders who surrender while their towns die and their children's futures are sold off piece by piece. A murmur of approval rippled through the gallery. The sharp contrast between Thune's call for compromise and Vance's call for action was striking. The press gallery scribbled frantically, the narrative was writing itself. Vance pressed on, his voice gaining momentum. You call me divisive. But what's more divisive than a government that protects corporate profits while ignoring the people who built this country? What's more destructive than promising to secure borders but never delivering? What's more dishonest than selling consensus while Americans lose faith in this very chamber? Gasps filled the room. Thune's face tightened. He had wanted to brand Vance as reckless, but instead, he was now the one appearing detached, almost aloof. Vance wasn't just answering the attacks, he was reframing the entire debate. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Thune's expression. He realized what many in the chamber were already whispering, this battle wasn't about experience versus inexperience. It was about establishment versus change. And at that moment, change had the louder voice. Thune adjusted his tie, buying a few seconds to gather himself. Years in the Senate had taught him how to handle fiery opponents, but JD Vance was proving immune to the usual tactics. He decided to switch angles. "Senator Vance," Thune said, his voice sharp, "you talk a lot about problems, but where are your solutions? Anyone can criticize, but only real leaders can govern." The chamber leaned in. It was a pointed challenge, the kind that could corner a less seasoned speaker. But Vance didn't flinch. He leaned into the microphone, his voice steady, deliberate. "Solutions," he said. "Let's start with securing the border instead of holding endless press conferences. Let's reinvest in American industry instead of sending tax dollars overseas. Let's rebuild families by supporting parents, not punishing them with policies that make life harder." These are solutions, but solutions scare this chamber because they require action, not empty talk. The crowd in the gallery stirred, some nodding, others whispering. Reporters captured every word. Vance's delivery wasn't just about substance, it carried the force of conviction, the kind that made people believe he actually meant what he said. Thune tried to retort. "Those are slogans, not solutions. Serious policy requires more than bumper sticker lines." Vance's eyes narrowed. "Slogans? Tell that to the factory worker who just lost his job because of policies crafted by people who've never set foot on a factory floor. Tell that to the rancher who buries his profits in red tape. Tell that to the young couple in Ohio who wonders if their kids will ever own a home. If speaking plain truth sounds like a slogan to you, maybe that says more about Washington than it does about me." The chamber broke into a wave of gasps, a few even clapping despite protocol. For the first time, Thune appeared on the defensive, his polished image dimming under the weight of Vance's blunt authenticity. The chamber was electric now, the kind of tension that only comes when two very different visions for America collide in real time. Thune could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, some urging him to strike harder, others silently acknowledging that JD Vance was commanding the moment. "Senator Vance," Thune said, raising his voice just enough to cut through the murmurs, "governing isn't a campaign rally. You can't simply play to the crowd. One day, if you ever hope to lead, you'll learn that stability matters more than applause." It was a calculated jab, but Vance didn't hesitate. He leaned forward, his tone sharper now, like a prosecutor delivering the final blow in a trial. "Stability?" Vance repeated. "Let me tell you what stability has meant for the American people, Senator. Stable inflation eating away at their paychecks. Stable open borders flooding their communities with chaos. Stable political elites trading speeches while the people who trusted them lose faith. If that's stability, then America deserves better." Gasps echoed through the gallery. Even some senators shifted uncomfortably at the brutal honesty. Reporters hammered their keyboards, knowing they were watching a viral moment unfold. Thune tried to shake it off, but Vance's words landed too hard. "We can't govern by rage," Thune shot back. "That's not leadership, that's recklessness." Vance paused, then delivered his sharpest line yet. "No, Senator. Recklessness is pretending everything is fine while the country falls apart. Recklessness is ignoring the people because you're too comfortable in this chamber. What you call rage, I call responsibility." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, JD Vance's presence seemed larger than the chamber itself. And in that silence, it was clear, Thune had been cornered, not by volume or spectacle, but by raw conviction. By now, the atmosphere felt less like a Senate chamber and more like a prize fight. Every word exchanged between Thune and Vance landed like a punch, and the crowd reacted to each blow with audible gasps or whispers. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of expression. Thune, visibly frustrated, tried to reassert control. "Senator Vance," he said sternly, "you confuse noise with leadership. You think being loud makes you right. But history favors those who preserve the institution, not those who burn it down." It was a line that echoed his decades of service, the steady, cautious tone of a man who believed survival meant patience. But the moment he finished, JD Vance struck back, his voice rising with conviction. "No, Senator," Vance replied. History doesn't remember the caretakers of broken systems. It remembers the men and women who had the courage to fix them. When Lincoln faced division, he didn't bow to the old guard. When Reagan faced economic despair, he didn't whisper about compromise, he acted. And now, when America faces crises from every direction, we need leaders who will fight, not fold. The crowd erupted. Some senators rolled their eyes, but others, particularly the younger Republicans, nodded in quiet agreement. Thune's argument, grounded in tradition, suddenly felt outdated against Vance's fiery invocation of history. Thune's voice dropped into a warning. And when your kind of politics tears this country apart, will you still call it courage? Vance's reply was immediate. If defending working Americans from betrayal tears apart the comfort of Washington insiders, then so be it. The chamber buzzed. The clash wasn't just personal anymore, it was generational, ideological. And it was becoming clear to everyone watching that this wasn't going to end with a handshake. It was a war for the soul of the party itself. The weight of the debate now pressed down on the chamber like a storm cloud. Senators who had been shuffling papers or checking their phones were suddenly glued to the exchange, sensing this was more than just another partisan spat. John Thune tried once more to pull Vance into his frame. You throw stones at Washington, but let me remind you, this institution has survived because men and women like me worked within the rules, not against them. You don't strengthen America by tearing down its foundations. His words had the polish of a veteran statesman, but Vance's reply cut through the air with raw force. Senator, Vance said, his tone steady but fierce, you call it foundations. The people call it decay. They don't see guardians in this chamber. They see gatekeepers protecting their own comfort while families drown in debt and towns lose their lifeblood. If the foundations are rotten, the only way forward is rebuilding, not patching cracks with speeches. A murmur ran through the room. Even some Democrats, usually content to watch Republicans spar, leaned in, intrigued by the audacity of the Ohio senator. Thune raised a finger, as if to deliver the final word. And when your fire burns down the house, what will be left to govern? Vance leaned in, his eyes flashing. What will be left? A country finally free of leaders who think governing means maintaining their own power. I'd rather rebuild a stronger house than live in one that's collapsing on the people who built it. The word struck like a hammer. Gasps, whispers, and even scattered applause broke protocol. For the first time, it wasn't clear whether this was a debate or the beginning of a seismic shift in the GOP's future. The chamber had become a battlefield of words, and everyone knew they were witnessing a moment that would echo far beyond the walls of the Senate. Thune leaned forward, his patience thinning. You think passion alone will carry you, Senator Vance. But passion without discipline is chaos. And chaos is the last thing America needs. The words hung heavy in the air, a challenge wrapped in a warning. But Vance, unshaken, met Thune's stare with a calm intensity. Senator, he replied, chaos isn't created by passion. Chaos is what happens when leaders refuse to act. When factories close, when families break apart, when our borders collapse, that's chaos. And it was born under the watch of men who confused inaction with wisdom. Gasps rippled through the room. Even a few members of Thune's own party exchanged uneasy glances. Vance pressed on, his voice rising. The American people aren't begging for more managed decline. They're begging for someone to fight for them, to tell the truth, even if it makes the comfortable uneasy. If that makes me passionate, then I'll wear that like a badge of honor. For a moment, the chamber went silent. Then, breaking protocol, applause erupted from the gallery, reporters, and even a handful of staffers tucked in the back rows. The Senate floor rarely saw such raw emotion, but tonight, it was unavoidable. Thune's face tightened. He had spent decades building his reputation as a voice of calm, but now, under the weight of Vance's fire, it looked less like calm and more like complacency. It was clear to everyone, Vance wasn't just holding his ground. He was turning the fight into a rallying cry. The final exchange carried a weight that no one could ignore. Every senator, staffer, and journalist present knew this was no longer just a clash of personalities, it was the symbolic battle for what the Republican Party would become. Thune drew in a breath, his voice lower now, as though he wanted to deliver one last lesson. Senator Vance, one day you'll understand that fire burns out. But discipline endures. And when that day comes, I hope you remember this chamber and what it stands for. The words were meant as wisdom, but they landed like a concession. JD Vance leaned forward, his tone steady, his gaze unblinking. Senator Thune, he said, discipline without vision is just obedience. America doesn't need obedient politicians. It needs leaders willing to risk comfort to save a nation that's slipping away. You can cling to yesterday's order. I'll fight for tomorrow's survival. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the furious typing of reporters capturing the moment. Then, as if on cue, the gallery erupted, applause, cheers, and shouts echoing through the chamber. It was unorthodox, even shocking in such a formal setting, but no one moved to stop it. For the first time in years, the Senate floor felt alive, not with scripted speeches but with the raw tension of history being written. Thune sat back, his expression hard to read, part defiance, part resignation. JD Vance, on the other hand, stood taller than ever, his words reverberating not just through the chamber but into the hearts of everyone who felt Washington had forgotten them. It was clear, this wasn't just a debate. It was a declaration. And by the end of the night, John Thune looked like a man of the past, while JD Vance carried himself as if the future already belonged to him.